Bourke, and I am the principal investigator for the SHAME project, SHAME standing for Sexual Harms and Medical Encounters. And today I am so thrilled to be able to have a talk with Dr. Elizabeth Roberts-Pedersen. She is based at the Department of History in the University of Newcastle in Australia. Importantly for us, though, she's also the Deputy Director of the Centre for the Study of Violence there, as well as being one of our Associate Fellows at SHAME. So I want to talk to you, Libby, about your work, particularly your work on sexual violence, your new stuff on sexual violence. But before I get to that, can you just tell us a little bit about your history, your previous research?
Sure, Joanna, and thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to talk to you. So I started out working on, I suppose, the social, cultural history of warfare. My doctoral work was on international volunteering in the 19th and 20th century. And then the next project I worked on was on psychiatry and the Second World War. I'm finishing up that tranche of work. Now, I suppose there's lots of crossover between the history of psychiatry and the history of ideas about sexual violence and abuse, and certainly if you look into the history of trauma, it's something that I think a historian working in that area has to grapple with. But in particular, I think working on warfare, particularly for me, thinking about, men in kind of martial environments, their interactions with civilians, has meant reckoning or trying to reckon and thinking about sexual violence in war zones. So sexual violence committed in wartime. And I did, previous to the grant that I'm about to start, which looks at that specifically, I'd spent some time, particularly in the Australian archives, investigating courts-martial procedures, because I was very interested in the way that discipline worked in the Australian Armed Forces in the 20th century. And there you do get a sense, I think, that there's an untapped, though increasingly uncovered history of the prosecution and some work around, policing sexual violence in wartime. And that's a theme that my new project is interested in.
Yeah, there are real challenges, I think, working on sexual violence, particularly, as you do in military contexts. What are some of the things that you are finding in terms of the challenges of working on it? The sources, for example, the difficulties we have in researching this kind of topic.
Right. So, you say sources, and this is something that it's worried me for years, actually, is trying to get into, I think the courts-martial records potentially are a very, very interesting and rich archive. But for reasons to do with the way, at least the Australian records have been organised, they've been very hard to access in an easy way, to sort of get hold of an index, or the way they're filed does not make them amenable to sort of easy quantification or categorization. Now, there's a wonderful project that's been happening at Griffith University where they're digitizing those records, all of the records. And so people working on this area, including me, are very hopeful that digitization and transcription project will throw up some data that's going to help us connect the Australian rates of sexual offending or sexual violence in wartime with the work that's been done in, American jurisdictions. So sources is one challenge. In general, as you would know, there is a kind of mythologizing of the Australian soldier that I think, contributes perhaps to a reluctance to dig into this area, although people have certainly done it. The other thing I'd say that remains, I think, fairly opaque, that people again are working on this, is the question of male-to-male violence, male-on-male violence. And I know you've written about this, the relationship between, some of the hazing rituals that sort of you could classify as a kind of sexual violence, and the particular impediments on male victims for speaking out and seeking redress.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in what you were saying just then about the sort of myth, the Australian myth, of the martial, Australian, man. I mean, have you had, or do you think you might experience a pushback from, the military in Australia and from more nationalist people in Australia to you doing this kind of work, which kind of undermines this idea of the martial Australian man?
Interesting you should ask that, Joanna, and I don't know how much it's been in the news overseas, but there's recently been a very damning report issued by the military itself about alleged war crimes committed by Australian soldiers in Afghanistan. And interestingly, the pushback that has come from that report, I think it might be a similar situation with the kind of work we want to do on sexual violence. It's not really come from the military. I mean, some people, it's not really come from the government, although there is starting to be blowback. It's from sections of the commentariat and sections of the public, and I would say a minority of commentators. So, I would be hopeful that this kind of research would not encounter too much official pushback. It may be that it does, and I'm being naive. But I think the armed forces in the last 10 to 15 years have recognised there needs to be a culture change. That's partly linked to concerns about mental health, both for serving personnel and for veterans. And so sort of interrogating internal cultures, I think, has become a little more normalised. And we'd hope that extends back into the historical record as well. But we'll see.
Yeah. I mean, recently, there's been a lot of reportage here in Britain and, in fact, all over the world about the Royal Commission that looked into institutional child sexual abuse in Australia. And I'd be interested to hear your views on that, because at least from my perspective, it's actually been seen or reported as quite a progressive commission in many, many ways, at least compared to other similar royal commissions looking into child sexual abuse. I mean, what's your view about that royal commission and its findings?
So yes, the effects of that. I mean, it was an encompassing report. So it was one of the last things that Julia Gillard did as Prime Minister was to set this Royal Commission in train. It sat for days and days and heard hours and hours of testimony. It was very wide ranging. And look, I would be hopeful that it's changing. It is changing perceptions, I suppose, about the potential prevalence of child sexual abuse within institutions. It's certainly increased the hopes, I think, for survivors and victims of those systems that there may be avenues for redress. But dealing with some of these institutions, I think, continues to be challenging, seeking compensation and redress. But there's certainly a lot of interesting research happening at my university. So someone like Kath McPhillips, who's done a lot of work on the Royal Commission, and not to instrumentalise what that commission has achieved, but the data that they have amassed that will gradually become publicly available for researchers going forward. And there's a real historicist dimension to that. It does document instances of abuse going back decades, patterns, I guess, of perpetration, the way institutions respond to perpetration and the way that perpetrators can be moved around. So I think it's incredibly important. And off the back of that, there's been calls for, inquiries into disability care, where again, there is, I think advocates would say that's an under-researched area, the vulnerability of people in certain kinds of care to sexual violence as well. So it's had all these effects. And hopefully, again, it's shifting a public conversation. I mean, I don't know how much you want to talk about. There's also been a lot of public advocacy about domestic and family violence in Australia in the last, 5 to 10 years. Now, I don't know that that's actually addressing the problem. You look at the rates of women murdered by current or previous partners, and they're still shockingly high. But again, raising the public consciousness, the potential for intimate relationships to be very unsafe for some women and include sexual violence, you hope it's coming to the fore more than it has been.
Yeah, and at least it's getting a conversation going about it and drawing public attention to it. I think one of the things when you're working with on sexual violence is, to get people talking about it, to get people admitting to it, and to get not only survivors, but also, people who may have perpetrated these things actually reflecting on what the situation is, what's happening in their own communities. Really interesting. Can I just move back to, your work on war? Because you've made your reputation as one of the leading historians of Australia and war, and now you're moving to sexual violence. So what I'm interested in is what you see are the connections. There are a number of different ways that people have approached this topic. In other words, some have said there's something particular about military and armed cultures that are particularly prone to acts of sexual violence. Others say, well, actually, no, the armed forces and military cultures are simply reflecting society more generally. Do you have a line on this?
Look, I don't. I suppose I have probably what's a fairly naive and just working, almost situational analysis that I look forward to having it challenged as we work on the Australian material. And, I know you've had things to say about this in your work on the history of rape and and rapists. But I wonder sometimes, maybe that does reflect a cultural predilection, that it's situational, that it's something to do with access to weapons. It seems to me often that rape in wartime, or maybe there may be a preponderance of gang rape, with weapons. And in the Australian case, I think if we're thinking about both world wars, you also can't get away from there's a sort of racialized element to this as well. So it's not a very good answer. Partly, I think it's opportunity, but then opportunity can't happen without a kind of a predisposition, what one would imagine. But it's an important question, and the whole idea of the perpetrator, like how we think about perpetration happening, it's a difficult question.
They are difficult questions, and particularly when you're looking at a context where there isn't much research that's already been done. I know there is some really superb research on sexual violence in the Australian context, but there's still not a huge amount out there that you can use to sort of parry ideas against, I think. Question: you are the deputy director of the Centre for...
I should say co-deputy director.
Co-deputy.
A deputy director. I think that's
for the Centre for the Study of Violence. And I've spent some fantastic times there in that centre. You've got such an amazing group of people intellectually working on various aspects of violence. A lot of people who'll be watching this won't actually know much about the centre. Can you just tell us what are the aims, what are the ambitions, why is it so important, and why is it, and correct me if I'm wrong here, isn't this the only kind of centre for the study of violence? And why is it based in Newcastle?
Well, I think it may be one of the few now. I think there are centres for study of violence in other institutions, and maybe one more in Australia, but it's possibly the oldest. It's been running for about a decade now, and it began with some senior researchers at Newcastle with international reputations in their respective fields. So Roger Markwick, who works on Soviet, particularly women in World War II, Philip Dwyer, who's an internationally very well respected biographer of Napoleon, and then Lyndall Ryan, who works on violence on the frontier, the Australian frontier, and is again an international reputation for the Massacre Map, which was one of the centre's early projects. And I suppose it was an attempt to historicise violence, to compare violence across time periods and cultures, but try to bring people together in conversation. And as it's grown, it's sort of moved, I suppose, from the interests of those founding directors to encompass things like sexual violence, trauma, and other aspects, I suppose, of the effects of violence. We've got a growing strength in, I suppose, Ottoman studies. Hans Lucas Kieser, who's a really key scholar of the Armenian genocide. Umit Kurt, who's joining us next year, who works on violence in, I guess, the Ottoman borderlands. Now, of course, there are questions in those instances about sexual violence perpetrated on particularly Armenian and other minority women in minority communities. So look, it's a wonderful place to work, and we hope we can keep growing and pushing on the conversation about violence with other people.
Yeah, great. I mean, I really hope to come back sometime. I mean, I just remember amazing discussions, amazing seminars, conferences that I've attended in Newcastle. So I hope to return. Just before we finish, I know, thank you so much for your time, but just before we finish, just one further thing, and that is the topic of sexual violence, whether you're looking at it as an historian or a sociologist or a philosopher or a literary person, I think two things. Firstly, it can sometimes be really tough to work in this field. So I think people who are listening may want to know a little bit about you personally, about how you deal with the real difficult subject matter. And I think finally I'd like to ask you, what would you say to an early career scholar who was thinking of working in this field?
It does. I'm not going to say it takes a toll, but it's difficult material to work with. It makes you reflect a lot on your own experiences. I have a young daughter and a young son, and as a parent, it makes me think about, questions around, consent and power and gender and how we need to have those discussions. I think, particularly maybe with young men, it's given me a lot to think about. And I think, if you're dealing with these kind of difficult material, you need to have, I think you said this to me once, Joanna, you need to have sort of good people in your life who you can decompress with, but also talk with when you need to. And I just say to, young researchers who are starting out, you're working with difficult material, but you're also working, I guess, in a difficult period in some ways for scholarship and the academy. We've just come through such a difficult year when our research has been disrupted by external circumstances of the pandemic. And I guess my advice would be to realize what you do is important and to pursue that to the extent that you're able within and without the academy. And particularly in terms of sexual violence, the work we do within universities is extremely important, but there's such a lot to be done outside the university as well, in all kinds of spheres, policy, activism, and there is a space for you to do that somewhere. And I admire, my admiration for all of you for pursuing this kind of work.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Dr. Elizabeth Roberts-Pedersen, thank you so much for talking to us. And we hope we can continue the conversation at another stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanna.